Hello, Lake Country Girl. Uh, Hello, Chris. Carol, please let me know if you can hear me. Hey, Deb. Catherine. Are you all hearing me okay? Yes, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning, Deb. Nancy, hi. And to you too, Deb. Happy, sweet, peaceful New Year to you too. And to everyone. Happy New Year, everyone. So why don't we just start? Hi, Peacenik. Aniko, let's start by just sitting quietly. I have a lot of very exciting things to share with you today. Hi there, Peacenik. Happy New Year. Oh, thank you, Diana. Yeah, we can just take a minute to enter into the shared space of this virtual medium. Beautiful, like-minded souls gathered together to explore the mysteries of life. Right here on just the second day of this new year. Hello, Bruce. So today I want to speak about the soul's journey to wholeness. And this is an extension. It's my most recent exploration. It's the direction my most recent explorations are taking me. It's an extension of an expansion on what's in this book. This is my most recent book publication, The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough. And this book is about the ways in which we interpret our spiritual experiences. Oh, thank you so much, Diana. Because not only do we have spiritual experiences, but we interpret them. And the interpretation of the experience is as important as the experience itself. In fact, ultimately, I don't think you can separate them. You can't really have an uninterpreted experience. You know, you'll interpret it in some way or another. You'll make meaning out of it in some way or another. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for being there. So we always are making meaning out of our experience. By the way, everyone, that's Daniel Allen of Metasoul. He just joined. Next week, he and I will be speaking here at this time together. I was just speaking to him before this call. He's a lovely young man and a true luminary, and I'm looking forward to sharing him with all of you next week. Just a preview of coming events. But as I was saying, the path of spiritual breakthrough is about how we interpret our spiritual experiences, how we make meaning out of them. We have experiences, then we interpret them. We might interpret them as they're not important. That's still an interpretation. Or we might interpret it as a life-changing event. And that's an interpretation. And how we interpret it changes what happens. And so this book is an exploration of different spiritual experiences, different types of spiritual experiences that I've had over the years, and how I've interpreted them. But the main focus is an exploration of the interpretive function in spiritual growth, what's called in traditional philosophy hermeneutics. And so that's what the path of spiritual breakthrough is about. Where that's been leading me is something that's been a growing fascination for about a year. Since I was doing research for the book I published about 6 months ago, Higher Self-Expression, and build, coming out of the work of a early 20th century scholar. Let's see if I can find one of his books. Here's one. An early 20th century scholar whose name is Henry Corbin. He was an Islamic scholar, and he writes incredibly beautifully. And what he writes about is a domain of existence that exists between heaven and earth. So, and he coined a phrase for that, which is mundus imaginalis, which translated into English means the imaginal world. It's sometimes talked about as the imaginal realm. And in very brief, what he says is that in modern times, our spiritual traditions, and he's mainly focused on Islam, but also secondarily on the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, and to some extent, traditions of the East. But in modern times, there's been much emphasis placed on heaven and earth, God and man, as a dichotomy. Above is the nameless being of the divine, that which we cannot enter in human form. We have to give up our human form to enter that perfection, because in that perfection there can be no other. There's perfect unity, oneness, right? You find unity with God by allowing your sense of separateness to fall away, and then you discover that you are all that is. But if you are all that is, there can be nothing outside of you. So there can be nothing to see. You can't see anything because there's nothing outside of you to see. So it's a mystery, right? It's an esoteric realm. It's incomprehensible. There can't be understanding there. There just is. And then, of course, life on earth, where we are separate selves, living our lives. So Henry Corbin said, well, there's a lot of emphasis placed on heaven and earth and how one goes from earth to heaven. But in the traditions, in the esoteric and mystical traditions, there was an enormous amount of emphasis placed on the in-between heaven and earth, which is the domain of the soul. It's what he calls the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, the imaginal realm. And it's not, heaven or pure divinity is non-material. It's completely non-material. And the earth realm is material. But in between, there's this imaginal realm, which is material, but not available to our normal physical senses. It's non-physical and yet material. It still exists. It's still a place. It's a real place. This sometimes in the Eastern tradition is talked about as the subtle realms, where we have a subtle body. It's a real body, but it's energetic. It's not physically material, but it's material in an energetic sense. And so I'm just doing a lot of contemplating and exploration and research, because I feel like there's something very important to uncover here for all of us. Because there's a journey that we're all on. And it's more than a journey of this separate self. I said I was speaking with Daniel this morning, and this is part of what we were speaking about. Our self extends far beyond the dimensions that are visible to our physical senses. We extend far beyond what our eyes can see and what our skin can touch and what we can taste and smell and hear. We extend beyond the physical. There are realms of existence that exist beyond the physical. I just want to give us a minute. This is not, I realize this is not new information, probably to anybody here. But if you're like me, you can still realize that this is a much more dramatically life-altering truth than it tends to have the effect of being. Because we all do live in a culture where that in-between realm, that soul realm, sometimes called the astral realm, sometimes called the angelic realms, it's been dismissed largely, right? And I think historically, the Age of Enlightenment, which was an age of reason and knowledge, which gave us the modern world that we live in today, and that was a huge leap forward for humanity in so many ways, recognized that there was a lot of superstition involved in ideas about angels and spirits, and so it wanted to say, okay, let's forget about that. Let's only deal with the things we can see. Let's only deal with the physical world, because that's the world we can see and touch. And that's where modern science, for instance, is most successful, in the physical realm. We've done amazing achievements. But it tends to dismiss the possibility of these non-material realms as fanciful. So one of my philosophical heroes, William James, who was basically an academic rock star 100 years ago, well, I guess now 120, 130 years ago, immensely popular throughout the world as an intellectual and a thinker, and so popular that he could basically get away with doing whatever he wanted. He did an enormous amount of psychical research. He believed in a realm beyond the physical. He believed that it was that some people had the capacity to go there, to journey there. And he risked his reputation to explore it. And he felt, he considered himself a scientist. He was actually a medical doctor first before becoming a psychologist. But he said, it's not scientific to dismiss aspects of reality without exploring them first. And so he wanted these more subtle domains of reality to be explored. So I want to encourage you right now to consider your own experience of the aspects of yourself that exist beyond the material. Have you encountered yourself? Have you recollected yourself? It's a beautiful word, recollecting. Having a recollection, a recollection. sometimes in dreams or in spiritual experiences. You know, that's part of what this book, The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough, is about. Sometimes we encounter deeper, more subtle aspects of ourselves. And we recollect them into our being. That's why I am framing the journey of the soul as a journey to wholeness. Now, you could also frame it, it has been framed by, for instance, the Spanish mystic, Christian mystic, St. John of the Cross, who wrote The Dark Night of the Soul. That's all about the soul's journey from darkness to light. The way I'm framing it today is a journey to wholeness, because there are these soul aspects of ourselves. You know, what in the Islamic tradition is according to Henry Corbin, are kind of our angelic aspects that exists in the imaginal realm. If we learn to perceive there, now this is what's amazing. Now this is partly what this book was about, and now I'm going further than this book in my explorations. But what's amazing is, and Henry Corbin wants to be very specific about this, this is not just a made-up world. The imaginal world is not just an imagination in the fantasy sense. It's not just something I'm making up. It's not fiction. It's real. It exists independent of me making it up. It's not something I'm making up, it's something I'm discovering. It's a real world, it's a real realm. It can't be perceived with the physical organs of sensation, the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and touch. It's perceived, and I don't know if I'll remember how he described it, but let me see if I can look. No, it's too hard to find things if you don't remember where they are. But basically, it's perceived by a certain kind of imaginal perception, an imaginal sense. You know, I think it's similar. I think basically in the East, when they speak about the third eye, they're talking about that. It's an inner eye. It's not a physical sensation. It's not just pure imagination where you just make stuff up, but it's an organ. It's an inner organ of perception. And as you develop the capacity for that, you begin to be able to see. And it's like passing into a different world. And everything in the physical world has its analog in the imaginal realm. It's a great question, Lake Country Girl. Let me get to it. So there's an analogous relationship. There's a symbolic relationship. And as you enter into this symbolic imaginal realm, and as you encounter that realm, as you learn to abide in that realm, what you start to see is that everything in the physical world is in a sense a representation of something in the subtle realms, of things in the subtle realms. You begin to realize that this physical world that we live in actually exists inside of a spiritual world. That the spiritual world is the context within which the world arises, and that what exists here in material form can be seen as symbols or icons of things that exist in the more subtle realms, the imaginal realms. So you start to live in this world. This is, sometimes they talk about the re-enchantment of the world. The world becomes re-enchanted because you begin to realize that this physical world is not the limit to what is. This isn't the end. It's not just all physical. This is just a thin veneer of physical representation. And just behind that thin veneer, there's this expanse of reality that can't be perceived with the five senses, but it can be perceived. And suddenly, being here is so magnificent. Being in this physical world, you're not just in the physical world. You're in this magnificent realm, this spiritual existence that has a material, physical aspect. So how do you develop that capacity? Well, one way, which is the way that I'm talking about in the path of spiritual breakthrough, is you learn to pay a lot of attention to the interpretive powers that you are always exercising. See, everything in this world is interpreted to a much greater degree than we are normally aware of, right? For instance, I hold this up to you and I say it's a book. We all think it's a book. But it's not a book. A book is an interpretation, right? This is just a physical thing with print on it. If I took this to a culture that had no idea what a book was and had no idea what language was, and I gave it to somebody, and it was now living there, it wouldn't be a book anymore. It would just be a thing. These wouldn't be words anymore. They would just be elements, design elements. So the modern philosopher Martin Heidegger talked all about how the world gets worlded. And that means how the physical universe becomes worldly items when meaning is attached to them. So this becomes a book when I understand what a book is and I call it a book. And that becomes meaningful to us if we live in a culture that understands that. So if I say to you, this is a book, you'll know an enormous amount about what I'm holding just by me saying it's a book. You'll know it's got pages, you'll know it's got words, you'll know it was written by someone, you'll know it has a cover, etc., etc. Because you live in a world which includes books. If this goes into a culture that has no understanding of books, then according to Heidegger, it is unworlded. It's been stripped of the world. It becomes a meaningless object. So, Lake Country Girl said, how do we develop that capacity? Well, one way is by exploring the ways that we create meaning all the time, so that you can really start to see, wow, they say, it's often said, we create our own world. Which in a very profound sense is true. And when you start to see that, you start to realize, wow, I am creating the meaning of everything that's here. I'm seeing things that are beyond what's actually here physically. I'm seeing ideas. I'm seeing a window. But a window is an idea. This that I'm looking at on the side, it's got wooden panels, it's got glass, right? It's just it's a collection of physical objects. Becomes a window when I recognize it as a window. So one of the things that I think is crucial to developing this capacity is a deep contemplation of the mechanisms of creating meaning that we are all always exercising. so that you can see how those mechanisms are at work, how they are creating the world you live in already. The challenge is that we're not taught that that's what's happening. We're just taught that that's a window. We're just taught that this is a book. But when you begin to see that that's a window because you think of it as a window, this is a book because you think of it as a book, you start to enter a different realm of being where there's much greater creative potential at work. Hello there, Pinky. And then the solidity of the world, of the physical world, starts to dissolve a little bit. Suddenly you realize, oh, this isn't quite so solidly independent of me as I thought. There's a co-arising occurring here. So that exploration is important to developing this capacity. I also believe that the kind of meditation that I teach, that just letting go, letting everything be as it is, disengaging is important. We have to disengage with our current world if we want to discover our true creative powers, our true capacity to create the world. We have to be willing to let go. So we discover how we create meaning all the time. And then we let go of the meaningfulness of the world that we have been indoctrinated into. At least we loosen up from it. And then we begin to experiment with new meaning making. And of course, this is the hardest part, because now we are finding the courage to interpret meaning differently and then live according to the new meaning that we create. You see, and then there's fear that arises because we aren't taught about this imaginal realm. We're taught that imagination is just imagination. And so we think, well, if I just start making stuff up and then acting as if it's true, nothing's going to work out because I'll just be living in a fantasy. And this is what Henry Corbin was arguing against. Now, another famous argument for this came from the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge, in his autobiography, wrote about the suspension of disbelief. And he was writing in the late 1700s. In the wake of the initial triumphs of the Enlightenment era and the modern world and the scientific world. And his fear was, and this is something important to consider here. There was a time in literature where the distinction between nonfiction and fiction was not a big distinction. People didn't think in terms of this writing is true and this writing is not true in the same way that we do today. Because today there's nonfiction, which means it's about reality, and there's fiction, which means it's just about made up stuff. But if you go back far enough, you look at stories like Beowulf or the King Arthur legends. whether those were true or fiction it wasn't a huge consideration. They're more like myths. What are myths are somewhere in between. They're not either true or fiction. They're not either nonfiction or fiction. They're stories. And they serve people. They teach. You learn from them. And Coleridge was afraid that as we became more and more wedded to the kind of scientific view that saw facts as facts and everything else as fiction, that we would lose our power for the suspension of disbelief. In other words, we would cease to be open to things that were not quote-unquote factual. And we would be closing down our imagination. And he feared that we would do that at our peril. In some ways, that's what Henry Corbin is saying has happened. That our culture in general has closed down the powers of imagination, so that now imagination is relegated to the domain of fantasy, of the purely made up. And that's why he wanted to introduce this term, Imaginal Realm. Because this is not just made up. And that's what you discover when you take the risk that I was just talking about. And it's the risk to reinterpret reality according to deeper spiritual principles and according to your spiritual breakthroughs. You reinterpret, you go, oh, well, if I experienced this, if I experienced the emergence of Kundalini, that must mean X, Y, or Z. If I experienced the love of divinity, that must mean X, Y, or Z. And I'm going to live as if X, Y, or Z. Because you don't get proof in that domain, in the material sense that we're taught to look for proof. And of course the fear is, well, I'm just going to be living a fantasy world. And look, that's possible. People do that. But this is what my experience has shown me. And if I'm careful, I have found that often, if I'm true to my deepest spiritual experiences and I reinterpret reality in accordance with them, and I take a step in that direction, and there's a part of me that's afraid, well, there's nothing over there. Like, I've now reinterpreted reality to say that this is possible, but my culture tells me it's not possible. My culture tells me it doesn't exist, but I'm going to take a step over there anyway. And there's a fear of like, oh my God, I'm going to fall right off the edge of reality, into the oblivion of non-existence because I just made stuff up. But you take that step, and even though to you it kind of feels like you're stepping into nothingness, at some point you encounter something and you realize, oh, it's there. This thing that I thought I was just making up turns out to be there. You encounter something. There's an existence to it that's independent of you. It's real in that sense. And then, over time, you do this more and more. You start to go, oh, if I'm truly listening, and this is the trick, you have to have discernment. You have to really be able to listen and to hear, the deeper parts of your soul. You can't just, because you can just make stuff up like fantasy, but then when you step that way, there's not going to be anything there. You're going to fall over. But if you really listen, you'll hear what the soul is telling you about what's real. And if you're listening to that, and then you are interpreting the reality of the senses through that lens, and then you step, you'll find that every time there's something to meet you. Every time there's sure footing. And that process is the process of how you develop the capacity to enter that world. And you keep doing that, eventually you start to live in a world, in this world of co-creation with reality. You, the separate you, is now working in concert with the deeper soul elements of you. And in concert, there's the creation of the world. And as you continue down that path, you discover more and more and more of your soul elements. You recollect them. You collect them back in. And the soul becomes more and more whole. You become more and more whole. More and more unified. More and more one with all the elements of yourself. And so that's the soul's journey to wholeness. And that is everything I wanted to share with you today. I am literally bursting with excitement about continuing this exploration of these soul domains. Next week I'll be speaking with Daniel, who was in here earlier, and the framework for his work is the meta soul. And it's his way of saying more or less what I was just saying. We're going to get to explore that with him. And most importantly, all of this is in service of our wholeness. Thank you, Deb. I'm not sure. I'm assuming you meant thank you, but I won't even say what that looks like without my glasses on it. So yeah, we can just sit here for a few minutes together, just resonating in the truth of the immensity of our soul. Oh, thank you, Deb. We are all so much more than we think. Thank you. So much more than we are aware of. There are so many aspects of who we are that hold immense power. And if we are cut off from them by some limited sense of self, then all we have access to is the power generated in this separate identity, which is really very minimal. So as we recollect other dimensions of who we are, the power that abides in those other dimensions becomes available and can be used to change the world, to transform ourselves, to transform the world. You are all beautiful, lovely people. I feel blessed to have another year to spend with you all. And I wish you all the best. Thank you for joining me today. Please join me next week when I will speak with Daniel of Metasoul. And please continue to explore the higher and more subtle dimensions of yourself. As the week continues. So thank you all very, very much. Much, much love. Bye now.